walked in as a volunteer to a very small public radio system. Now it takes a PhD in communications before you can even put a pair of headphones on.
Renowned public radio talk show host Diane Rehm today on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson. One day in 1973, a 37-year-old former State Department secretary with no radio experience walked into a radio station in Washington, D.C. to volunteer her services. It was a public radio station. Now, they took her on as a volunteer, and within 6 years, she was on the air. And shortly after that, they gave Diane Rehm her own talk show, and for the next 32 years, Diane Rehm was a fixture on public radio, not just in Washington, D.C., but across the country, syndicated via public radio. Now, in her early 60s, Diane Rehm faced a serious health challenge, a vocal cord disorder that threatened to cut short her career. Ultimately, and fortunately, she found medical treatment and was able to resume her on-air performances. Now, in 1999, Diane Rehm wrote a book, a long-awaited autobiography called Finding My Voice. And suddenly, this woman who had been interviewing everyone who was everyone, the rich, the powerful, the famous, suddenly herself became the interviewee. I met with her in the fall of 1999 to talk about her book. In just a moment, our conversation.
We're about to take a step back and listen to an iconic voice from our recent past. It's one of over 10,000 interviews noted radio personality Bill Thompson did over a 30-year span. We think you'll enjoy it.
So here now from 1999, talk show host Diane Rehm.
For years, a friend of mine who eventually became my agent, Ron Goldfarb, kept pursuing me and saying, you've got to write a book, you've got to write a book. And I kept saying, look, I do a daily 2-hour broadcast. I don't have time to write a book. Then as the 20th anniversary came closer, he sort of began to get on my nerves. And then he said, well, we could do a book with some of your transcripts and then you could write a little commentary. And I thought, that is the most boring thing in the whole wide world. I'm not going to do that. So one day when John left for Africa, he was going to Kampala, I thought, well, I'll sit down and see what happens. And what happened, Bill, became revelatory to me. People have asked whether it was a catharsis. It was not really catharsis because that's sort of a deliberate letting out. I had no idea what was going to come, and what came was revealing to me about my own family, my background, about getting into radio, and the experiences I've had in more than 20 years of talk radio, and finally, this disorder called spasmodic dysphonia.
Well, you, I'm sure, have interviewed many, many people over the years who have written memoirs, written autobiographies, and you've discovered, I'm sure, as I have at this end of the microphone, they often say, well, I sat down to write it, and then I realized I was going to have to tell things that I wasn't sure I wanted to tell, go into details that I wasn't sure I wanted to go into. And suddenly, once you've got a signed contract, they've given you the advance. They expect a book, and they expect it to be an honest book. And you have to debate, well, do I want to put this in the book or not? Did that face you?
Well, there was a perfectly wonderful moment with my editor, Bob Gottlieb, who tends to be a night person, and I'm a morning person. So he and I would talk quite frequently shortly before I went to sleep. And one night he said to me just before I went to sleep, Diane, you've got to decide just how much of yourself you want to reveal, how much you're willing to share. That night, Bill, I went to sleep and dreamt that someone came into the bedroom and whitewashed the walls. And that for me was a sign of precisely the kind of book I did not want to write. If I was going to write a book, I was going to tell an honest story, and I think I've tried to do that.
Even though it would be painful to do.
Even though it would be painful to do, not only for me, but for my relatives, my extended family of origin, who all thought of my mother, for example, as the beautiful, talented, darling, lovely, loving Eugenie. To me, she was someone different, and that became a central focus of the first part of the book, primarily the silence to which she exposed me and the silence in which I lived out of fear of saying or doing something that was going to provoke her wrath.
It's one thing then, of course, to write it, but then it's another thing to realize millions of people are going to read this, not just now while you're on the tour, but for many, many years to come. Do you weigh carefully what goes on the page when you realize it has that kind of permanence?
I think what you do is to tell the truth, to tell an honest story, and then to decide whether you can live with that honest story, as you say, being read by people not only now, but who knows for how long. I know that many of my relatives are not happy, even though I tried to tell them as I was writing the book. You know, they are proud of me. They love the fact that I have a nationally broadcast radio program, and they would tell me how much they loved the show and how they were looking forward to reading the book. And again, I would say to them, you're not going to like this book. But saying that and then having them read that are two very different things.
There's something about seeing it in cold type on a page that makes a big difference.
In fact, after a substantial story came out in the Washington Post about the book, one of my relatives called and said, have you any idea how furious everyone is with you? And I said, well, I tried to tell them, and I'm sorry if they are furious, but it's my story, and I needed to tell it. And I'm glad I've told it, because from the tenor of the tour I've had thus far, and it's only about 5 cities, I can only tell you the extent to which people identify with that notion of having to keep secrets and having to pretend and being left in silence, and what a difference it makes to read that someone is willing to say it out loud.
Now, we don't want readers to get the wrong impression, though. This is not a downer of a book at all.
I hope not.
There are a great many triumphant and joyous moments in this book as well.
I happened to get into talk radio totally by accident. I was a volunteer, walked in as a volunteer to WAMU-FM here in Washington, part of a very small but growing public radio system. This was back in 1973. And at that time, you could, as a volunteer, sort of get in and do everything. Now it takes a PhD in communications before you can even put a pair of headphones on. I was lucky enough to work as, what can I say, a volunteer and assistant, and learn the ropes that way. Eventually, I got my own show, and it's now broadcast not only across the country, but around the world. And so now I've written the story of how that came about.
After this short break, Diane Rehm talks about the health challenge that nearly ended her career.
Are you enjoying this conversation so far?
And would you like to get a copy of the book we're talking about?
Just tap the link in our show notes or visit our website, heardeverything.com.
When you make a purchase through our affiliate links, you're also supporting this podcast.
And we thank you for your support.
Now back to my 1999 conversation with Diane Rehm.
The third part of the book really has to do with my voice, which is not your normal radio voice to begin with.
Well, actually, on the contrary, I have been listening to you for years. I love this. It's because it is, all right, maybe it's not the classic, what you would think of as the booth announcer's radio voice, but it's so soothing. It is so reassuring. It is a voice of calm and reason and common sense and courtesy and dignity and pride and all the things. I feel comfortable. I feel good about myself when I listen to your show.
Oh, what a lovely thing to say. What began to happen to me was that I heard a slight tremor in the voice. And once that began, it sort of started getting worse. And I began to worry about it, which made it even worse. Finally, in February of 1998, here is how I sounded. I could barely get a word out. And obviously something was wrong. But the doctors kept saying to me, your throat's fine. They kept putting tubes down my throat. They kept, the worst was in my imagination. Finally, I had to get off the air because it was so bad. And I just left the office and said to my manager, I've got to find out what's wrong with my voice. And he said, how long will you be gone? And I said, I have no idea. And he said, take as much time as you need, which was wonderful. But for the next 3 months, I took every kind of medication imaginable. I went to every kind of therapist imaginable, and still the voice was straining. I wouldn't answer a telephone. I wouldn't talk to any but my closest friends. Finally, one day I talked with my internist, and she said to me, enough of this. We're going to send you to Johns Hopkins, and there I received a diagnosis of spasmodic dysphonia. For the listeners who don't know what that is, it's a form of dystonia that originates in the basal ganglia of the brain. With spasmodic dysphonia, the brain sends an incorrect message to the vocal cords, telling them to clamp down inappropriately. So, periodically, I receive injections of botulinum toxin directly into the vocal cords that temporarily paralyze those vocal cords so they're wide open, and then I can only whisper. And then eventually they come back together, vibrate normally, and you hear my voice.
A good, strong voice.
A good, strong voice. I had an injection 6 weeks ago. Prior to that, I had gone 3.5 months without an injection. I hope that with some new medication, we may even be able to carry this on longer.
I'm guessing that for most people, loss of voice or loss of control over your voice would be an inconvenience, an interruption in your normal routine. But for a radio personality, this has got to be the most devastating kind of news you could get.
It's not just for a radio personality. My speech pathologist, Susan Miller, and I have begun a spasmodic dysphonia support group. And people with ordinary jobs, people who need to go to work every day to make a living, people who need to be on the telephone. Bill, it's like losing your sight. It's like losing your hearing. It's so awful. You walk into a drugstore and you cannot say your name to ask for a prescription. You cannot go to the grocery store for fear of having to ask someone for something. At a restaurant, you don't want to order. So it's not just for someone who's a radio broadcaster. It's for ordinary people. And as I said before, there is no cure. There is research going on trying to find out what begins this process and why is it that so many more women, as they get older, seem to encounter this problem than do men.
Well, every review I've read of this book makes reference to this being a rare disorder. The rare disorder of spasmodic dysphonia. Rare, this rare. Is it as rare as they think it is?
There is such a wide range of speculation, from 50,000 to 500,000 people. And the reason that that figure is so disparate is because people are ashamed. They are afraid to find out what's wrong with them, and so they go into hiding.
They no longer need to be afraid.
Well, they just determine that the best thing to do is to stay shut up in the house. They don't answer the phones. They don't go anywhere where they have to speak. So I think eventually my hope is that we'll get to the bottom of whatever this is and find a cure. I hope so.
Diane Rehm is 88 now. She still hosts a weekly podcast. Now, you can get your copy of Finding My Voice by Diane Rehm by tapping the link in our show notes, by clicking the link in the description below if you're watching this on YouTube, or by going to our website, heardeverything.com. We may earn an Amazon commission if you make a purchase. Heardeverything.com is where you can also find my interviews with two other well-known and renowned talkers. My 1988 conversation with Larry King.
The main thing you have to be is be honest. If you don't know something, say you don't know it. If a guest says a word you don't understand, ask him to explain it. Never be afraid of looking stupid.
And my 2012 conversation with the great Barry Farber.
Is there anybody you don't know?
No, there are plenty I don't know and haven't met. It's not who you meet, it's what you get them to say into your microphone.
Yes.
And of course, we post new episodes of Now I've Heard Everything every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you can find us everywhere you find podcasts. And thank you so much for listening. Next time on Now I've Heard Everything, for Father's Day, we'll revisit a conversation I had with the son of a well-known actor, singer, very popular person from the 1950s and 60s, Tennessee Ernie Ford, my 2008 conversation with his son, Jeffrey Buckner Ford.
The truth of the matter is, Ernie Ford was never a hillbilly, but knew how to identify people that might be identified as that and talk to them.
That's next time on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson.